Hey everyone, it's Glenn Greenwald, and I'm back with a new episode of System Update here at our home on Rumble. And I am here essentially to ask a question of Democrats, one that is very genuine and very earnest, which is, why are you not every day angrily protesting outside of the Biden Justice Department? Or if you can't get to Washington, somewhere on the streets of your own city, angrily protesting the fact that the Biden Justice Department, 8 months after or 9 months after the events of January 6th, still has not charged even a single person with any of the very grave crimes that you've been told over and over by your political leaders, by your party, by the media outlets with which they're aligned were committed on that day. Treason, sedition, inciting an insurrection, attempts to kill or murder or kidnap elected political officials. All these crimes that you were told with certainty were committed on that dark, dark day in history, what Joe Biden called the gravest attack on American democracy since the Civil War. Why is it that even when the Justice Department, the Biden Justice Department under Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, has charged over 600 people, 600, not one of them has been charged with any of those crimes? If it were me, and I actually believe that that were an insurrection, an attempted coup, and those crimes were committed that day trying to conspire or plot to kidnap AOC or murder Mike Pence or other very high-level sacred elected officials, I'd be furious that the Biden Justice Department is not charging anyone with any of those crimes, instead charging them with much lower level misdemeanor crimes, and even the ones that committed violence, basically just kind of assault charges. Now, the reason why I would be particularly indignant about this enormous gap between what I've been told happened on January 6th and what was likely to happen on the one hand, and the reality of what the Justice Department is doing on the other, is because this is not the first time there's been an enormous gap between the prevailing media outlet about grave crimes on the one hand that liberals overwhelmingly believed, and the reality of what the Justice Department ended up doing. It's exactly the same thing, in fact, that happened during RussiaGate. Remember, for 2 years, if not longer, Democrats and liberals were told by their favorite pundits and talk show hosts and people like Adam Schiff and the political leaders they most respect that there was conclusive smoking gun evidence of serious crimes, of criminal conspiracy between, on the one hand, the Trump campaign and its officials, and on the other, the Russian government, to criminally interfere in the 2016 election. That's what they were told over and over, right up until the end of the Mueller investigation. Let's look at what John Brennan, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and now like virtually every former high-level member of the security state, an employee of a corporate media outlet, this case NBC and MSNBC, on March 5th, 2019, so just the month before the Mueller investigation was closed by Robert Mueller and he issued his report. Listen to what he told liberals was likely to happen, what they should expect.
For example, this week on Friday, not knowing anything about it, but Friday is the day that the grand jury indictments come down. And also this Friday is better than next Friday because next Friday is the 15th of March, which is the Ides of March. And I don't think Robert Mueller will want to have that dramatic flair of the Ides of March when he is going to be delivering what I think are going to be his indictments, the final indictments, as well as the report that he gives to the Attorney General.
What makes... Now, let me just interrupt there to talk about how funny that is, first of all. This is how Robert Mueller was being talked about at the time. Did you see what John Brennan just said? I think it was subtle, and a lot of people like Lawrence O'Donnell, who was sitting next to him, didn't really get it. But he was saying, we know for sure, because in the air, there were reports that Mueller was getting to the end of his investigation. And John Brennan was saying, we know for sure there are going to be more indictments, which we'll get to in a second. But it's probably not going to be next Friday, because that is the Ides of March, and Robert Mueller is much too sober and serious of a public servant to even think about doing something so dramatic as issuing the final dramatic indictments on the Ides of March. Therefore, it's more likely that they're going to come this Friday. So, but the more important thing was he was telling the MSNBC audience, using his expertise, or supposed expertise as CIA director that more indictments were coming. And Lawrence O'Donnell goes on to ask him, what do you mean more indictments are coming? Why do you say more indictments are coming? And his answer was extremely important. Listen to what he told people to expect was going to happen.
Do you believe that he has more indictments?
Because he hasn't addressed the issues related to criminal conspiracy as well as any individuals.
Criminal conspiracy involving the Russian influence?
Russians, yes, yeah. I think it was very,
and
in
that's
terms of
an area,
American person, U.S. persons.
That's an area you know something about. That investigation was developing while you were still on the job.
Well, it was, in terms of looking at what was going on with the Russians and whether or not U.S. persons were actively collaborating, colluding, cooperating, and involved in a conspiracy with them or not. But also if there's going to be any member of the Trump family. Did you see enough
at that stage to believe that there would now that would result in indictments once investigated?
I thought at the time that there was going to be individuals who were going to have issues with the Department of Justice. Yes, and I think we've already seen a number of individuals who have been indicted, either have pled guilty or have been convicted now. So again, I don't have any inside knowledge. I'm not talking with anybody in special counsels.
Yes, you do. You have the inside knowledge.
But not about the status of the investigation right now.
Yeah.
But I do think also if anybody from the Trump family, an extended family, is going to be indicted, it would be in the final act of Mueller's investigation, because Bob Mueller and I think his team knows that if he were to do something, indicting a Trump family member, or if he were to go forward with indictment on criminal conspiracy involving U.S. persons, that would basically be the death knell of the special counsel's office, because I don't believe that Donald Trump would allow Bob Mueller to continue in the aftermath of those types of actions.
John Brennan, thank you very much. You have to listen to every word in the John Brennan answer. Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
You have to listen to every word of the John Brennan answer. And let's look at the 2 points that he told liberals. And this was what they were hearing for 2 years or not more, if not more, was going to happen. He was saying, number one, he knows the Mueller investigation is not yet finished, that more indictments are coming, because up until that point, not one American had been indicted on the core crime that led to the entire scandal and the appointment of Robert Mueller in the first place, which was the claim that American citizens, people who were working with the Trump campaign or adjacent to it, had engaged in criminal conspiracy, as he said, with the Russian government. He was saying, we don't have any indictments yet on criminal conspiracy, and obviously those are coming. That's the crux of the investigation. That was the first point. And then the second point he said was, we know that members of the Trump family, like Trump Jr. or Jared Kushner or Ivanka, are going to be part of the people who get dragged out of the White House in handcuffs as well. That is what liberals were primed to believe also for 2 years. And so a month before Robert Mueller closed his investigation and everyone knew it was coming to an end, there was John Brennan telling everyone, this is what you should expect. We know people are going to be indicted for criminally conspiring with the Russians, and it's likely to be close members of the Trump family. There had been arrests and indictments and guilty pleas, as he said, but they were only on process crimes. People lying to the FBI, George Papadopoulos going to prison for 10 days. What he was saying was the crux of the investigation hasn't yet resulted in any arrests, and obviously that's going to happen, and that's why we're waiting. Now, as we know, none of that happened. That month, Robert Mueller issued his final report on the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. In March of 2019, so just a week or so after John Brennan told everyone this was coming, those arrests and conspiracy indictments, he closed his investigation without having indicted a single American. Not one American, not even like a low-level Trump person like Carter Page or anybody, on the crux of the investigation, criminally conspiring with Russia, let alone a member of the Trump family. So everything liberals are primed to believe all the way up until the very end didn't happen. Mueller closed his investigation. The next month, his report was made public, and the key passage essentially said the entire thing was a scam from the beginning. Quote, although the investigation did establish that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and that the campaign expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. The investigation did not establish the crime that liberals were told for 2-3 years had for sure been committed that necessitated this entire scandal and special counsel investigation. They were building statutes to Robert Mueller because he was coming to arrest all their political adversaries, and he closed his investigation with 0 arrest on that court charge, and by saying that the investigation did not establish that this conspiracy took place. A huge blow if you're a liberal who believed what you were being told for all those years, to watch this doomsday date come and go without even a whimper, let alone a bang or an explosion. So now, after having endured that, and they're trying to deal with that in all sorts of ways. Adam Schiff has a new book out, basically accusing Robert Mueller, who nobody was allowed to speak ill of until about a year ago, of being senile, saying it was pitiful watching him try and struggle with his diminished capabilities. They have to give liberals some explanation to explain the discrepancy between what they were told to expect and what in fact happened. And now with January 6th, exactly the same thing has been taking place for this entire year since January 6th. There's been a narrative that up until now has not even come close to matching the reality. Now, here was a Reuters article on August 20th, so about 2 months ago, prepping liberals to again accept that what they were told is what happened is not going to be what the government ends up claiming because they don't have the evidence. The headline read, quote, exclusive, FBI finds scant evidence U.S. Capitol attack was coordinated. The article read, quote, the FBI has found scant evidence that the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol was the result of an organized plot to overturn the presidential election, according to 4 current and former law enforcement officials, though federal officials have arrested more than 570 alleged participants. The FBI at this point believes the violence was not centrally coordinated by far-right groups or prominent supporters of then-President Donald Trump, according to the sources who have been either directly involved in or briefed regularly on the wide-ranging investigation. So all this talk about how this was a coordinated plot and an insurrection, an attempted coup, Reuters and the Justice Department are purposely trying to prime liberals to again be prepared to swallow the reality that they were again lied to, that there was no coordination. This was not a well-coordinated, centralized insurrection. It was just an organic protest that, as so many protests do, spun into some violence and riot because of the passions that were ignited and was put down after about 3 hours, which is why it wasn't an insurrection and no one has been charged with that. Now, here we are 8 months later, after having endured the crushing blow of what happened with RussiaGate, liberals coming to terms with the fact that all the things they were promised, Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert were all going to be expelled from Congress and arrested, and all these fantasies that they had about this sweeping insurrection. None of it has happened. So how are they dealing with it? Here, yesterday, November 1st, on Monday, is Dr. Jason Johnson, who's a frequent MSNBC guest. He's a doctor and demands to be called doctor in the same way that Jill Biden is a doctor. He went on MSNBC and kind of understandably is furious that the Biden government, the Biden administration, isn't making more of January 6th than he thinks they should, given everything they were convinced that it was. And here he tweeted out his own appearance on MSNBC with former Bush Cheney White House spokesperson Nicole Wallace, who's now a popular host of MSNBC, where he says part of why Biden's poll numbers are low is because Americans feel like they were punched in the gut on January 6th. And he hasn't fight back. I think he means he hasn't fought back on our behalf. He should be talking about terror just as much as Bill Clinton and George Bush did for 20 years. Think about what he's saying there. Biden's approval numbers are precipitously collapsing. And he thinks it's not because of gas prices or COVID or employment conditions or economic struggles or crises at the border or any of the other things that have plagued Joe Biden's administration, the extraordinarily inept evacuation of Afghanistan, leaving Americans behind when they promised they wouldn't, eviscerating a family of 10 people, including 7 children, with a drone, and then lying about what he thinks it's. None of that is why his approval numbers are tanking. He thinks it's because Biden's not talking about what's on everybody's mind, which is January 6th. I mean, how insulated do you have to be in like the green rooms of MSNBC and CNN or in academia to believe that the reason why Joe Biden's not popular is because he's not talking about January 6th enough? But listen to what he said, because I find it so revealing of the liberal mindset and the question that I asked at the beginning about why aren't they protesting outside the Biden Justice Department. Here's what Dr. Johnson said on Nicole Wallace's MSNBC daytime show.
It shouldn't all be on the 1-6 Commission. It should also be on the Department of Justice. Why isn't Merrick Garland screaming about this every single day? Why isn't the president screaming about this every single day, at least from a symbolic standpoint? Nicole, I can tell you, before we even get to the specifics of this is also, believe it or not, in a larger macro political sense, this is also why Biden's numbers are where they are. Those people who voted for him, those Americans who actually believe in this country, believe in democracy, including people who didn't vote for Biden but are certainly not insurrectionist terrorists, they feel like they got punched in the face on January 6th. They saw the whole country get attacked. And they want a president who's going to fight back. They want a president who talks about these terrorists the same way that we heard George Bush and Bill Clinton talk about terrorism for 20 years. They want to hear that about these people. It seems like they're being treated with kid gloves. And a lone committee that has limited power, that's hamstrung by basically a whole bunch of Benedict Arnolds on the Republican Party, is not going to be enough to keep us safe. There is nothing right now, other than perhaps the lone efforts of a couple of Capitol Police officers. There's nothing right now to keep Josh Hawley from taking the chains off the back door and letting people sneak in like a high school shooter. I mean, that's essentially what we're looking at right now. And so that's why people are legitimately concerned about this. And I'll close with this because I also think it's important. As Frank points out, people were concerned about constitutional rights. No, these people were concerned about getting fired. They don't care about our democracy. If they did, they would have been more serious about this. And I swear I don't hear anybody getting that concerned about constitutional rights when they're knocking black people's heads up against the wall for fighting for rights and justice.
I mean, where do you even begin with that insanity? The idea that Americans are craving to hear more about January 6th, the fact that Josh Hawley is ready to unlock the doors and let people come in order to do a terror. I mean, this is insanity, this stuff, but this is what they've been feeding on for so long. And in the defense of Dr. Johnson, he was told, just like all these liberals were, they were fed a narrative that in some way makes it rational for him to be demanding much, much greater action than the government is actually undertaking. I mean, if what happened on January 6th really was what they were told, he's kind of right that the Biden Justice Department would be doing way more and Joe Biden would be talking about it way more. But everyone knows, except for them, that it's a myth. But look at what they've been told from the very beginning. Here on January 15th from the LA Times, so just the week after the January 6th riot, quote, Capitol rioters aim to, quote, capture and assassinate officials, federal prosecutors alleged. So imagine if you actually believe that those people in the Capitol were there to capture and assassinate officials. Wouldn't you be angry as well? That up until now, the Biden Justice Department has not charged anyone with trying to capture and assassinate officials, that Joe Biden's not really ever talking about it anymore. Remember what Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did, the drama she created on the day she reappeared after many hours after it was all over, and she just put a 2-word tweet, I'm okay, as though the entire world was thinking, oh my God, with all the people who are dead in the Capitol, the dozens and dozens of members of Congress who have been hung and killed, is AOC okay? And she came forward and said, I'm okay. They were all okay. Every last one of them. The only one who wasn't okay were 4 Trump protesters, 2 of whom died of a heart attack, one of whom before he'd even started, a third of whom had an accidental speed overdose, and then the 4th one, the only one who was murdered with violence, was Ashley Babbitt, who was unarmed and shot point blank in the neck. Of course AOC was okay. They were all okay. There was no murder or kidnapping of elected officials or an attempt to do so, which is why no one has been charged. Remember as well what she said to Ted Cruz when he tried to work with her over abuses in the stock market, when the Redditors were driving up the price of various stocks, and the Robinhood app interrupted them and prevented them from doing so to protect hedge funds. And she went on Twitter and said, this is an abuse. And he said, I agree with you, AOC. I'm ready to work with you to stop this. And she famously replied at the end of January, I am happy to work with Republicans on this issue where there's common ground, but you almost had me murdered 3 weeks ago. So you can sit this one out. Happy to work with almost any other GOP that aren't trying to get me killed. In the meantime, if you want to help, you can resign. Of course, that went super viral. This is what they were feeding on, that they had sent people to murder AOC, and that there were dozens of people in Congress who were on the verge of being kidnapped and assassinated by insurrectionists. And now what's the reality? None of that. From Reuters in June, quote, no seditious conspiracy charges emerge in U.S. Capitol riots cases. No seditious conspiracy. Not few. None have been charged with conspiracy to commit sedition. Here is from AP in July. Are January 6 rioters traitors? So far, criminal charges say no. The article went on. To date, neither Caldwell nor any of the other more than 500 defendants accused in the attack has been indicted for sedition or for the gravest of crimes a citizen can face, treason. And as an increasing number of lesser charges are filed and defendants plead guilty, those accusations may never be formally levied. So put yourself, and I know it's difficult and unpleasant and painful and kind of gross, in the position of a standard Democrat or liberal. You heard for 3 years that this enormous attack on democracy had been perpetrated because Trump officials had criminally conspired with Russia to interfere in our sacred democracy. You kept hearing and waiting for the big bad FBI Superman Robert Mueller to come and arrest all of your political enemies, all the Trump family members, Steve Bannon, all of them, not on trivial process crimes, but on criminally conspiring with Russia. And the investigation closes. He charges none of them with that and says he couldn't find evidence to establish that it even happened. Imagine what a gut punch, to use Dr. Johnson's term, that must have been. And now they're faced with the same exact problem psychologically. All the people they trust told them, and they worked themselves up into this frenzy, believing that January 6th really was the worst attack on American democracy since the Civil War, that it was an insurrection and a coup, that they were looking and plotting to kidnap and assassinate government officials. And yet the Biden Justice Department has not charged a single person with that. And they, of course, the day may come when they do, but so far they haven't. It looks like they're getting liberals ready to accept that it won't through leaks like the one to Reuters, that they can't even find evidence of centralized planning. So if you're a liberal or a Democrat like Dr. Johnson, and you really believe that an insurrection happened on January 6th, an attempted insurrection and a coup, by people who were seditious and treasonous and setting out to kidnap and kill AOC, who turned out okay, but only by luck, and other elected officials, how are you not incredibly indignant not at me or Republicans, but at the Biden Justice Department? I asked Dr. Johnson that question on Twitter when he responded to my noting what he had said, and he replied by saying, Glenn, since you've done the full heel turn from the apologist for white nationalists to Sarah's sympathizer, please educate those of us who still live in America how best to deal with a mob who sought to murder elected officials based on a lie. Now, what a surprise that his tactic is to accuse people who disagree with him or who criticize him of being an apologist for white nationalists and terrorist sympathizers. That should shock nobody. It's so overused that no one cares anymore. But he's demanding of me, please educate us about what we should do to deal with the mob who sought to murder elected officials based on a lie. And my response to him was, ignoring the fact that you're trying to imply that because like 9 million American citizens, I don't live in the country and therefore I don't have a right to comment. Quote, if I believe people tried a coup and attempted murder on 1/6, I'd be protesting every day outside the Biden DOJ because nobody has been charged with that. That really is the real question that I don't understand how they can possibly answer. If it's either one of two things, either they know that what they're saying is not really true. They know there was no insurrection. It was just a protest that turned into a short riot, like has happened many times. And that's why there's no one being charged with insurrection, sedition, treason, attempted kidnapping, and murder, because it didn't really happen. They either know they're lying or they really believe it, which I think they do, but they just don't have the capacity to criticize their own leaders, to demand of their own leaders answers, to hold them accountable about why they're not going after these traitors, these insurrectionists, these seditionists, these attempted murderers and kidnappers who tried to murder AOC and others on that fateful day. And I would really love to have an answer to that question, because the rhetoric around January 6th, even though it hasn't resulted in convictions, it has created a climate where a second war on terror has been issued, where people have been held in extremely harsh prison conditions, despite being convicted of no crimes, where their civil liberties are being trampled upon, where we're getting more money again for the FBI and the CIA and more surveillance authorities, more detention authorities. So a lot is happening that's quite damaging because of this narrative. So we have the obligation to examine whether it's true. And I think we should begin with the people who insist it is true, to ask why they're not acting as though they really believe it by protesting the Biden Justice Department for malfeasance.